Hello and welcome. I'm Light and this is my channel. And today we're going to talk about some very famous people who vanished, just disappeared and were never seen again. Before we get started, if you would please give this video a thumbs up. If you're not subscribed, please do so. You're under no obligation, it's totally free, and you'll be notified when my content goes up. Alright, let's get started talking about this, shall we? Richie Edwards was an intense person. He was also a brilliant music writer, and he wrote music for his band, the Manic Street Preachers. He wrote almost all of the music on their album in 1994, and it was called The Holy Bible. And just before his U.S. promotional tour was supposed to start, the 27-year-old vanished. Just one day before he was scheduled to fly to the United States on February 1st, 1995, the 27-year-old Edwards vanished. He was reportedly seen by fans and a cab driver in the following days, but his car was eventually found near what is called the Severn Bridge, and it is a known unaliving site. At the time, Edwards was said to be struggling with depression and self-harm, anorexia, and alcoholism, but his body was never found. In 2008, over a decade later, his family had him legally presumed dead, but as their lawyer explained, it was more of a move to kind of get his affairs in order, saying that it's not the same as acceptance that he is dead. In the years since, though, people have claimed to see him all over the world, always under a new name, always just out of reach. Some people point to his fascination with disappearing as what had happened to him, because before he vanished, he gave his friend a book, and it's called Novel with Cocaine, and he asked him to read the introduction, where the author wrote about vanishing from society. A 2019 book that was written about him, entitled Withdrawn Traces, was written in cooperation with his sister, Rachel Edwards, and she says the same thing, that he had shown interest in the idea of faking one's own death and disappearing in the years before he did, in fact, disappear. She told GQ magazine, though, that we know no more now than we did 25 years ago. Next is Lord Richard John Bingham, also referred to as Lord Lucan. He was a charming, wealthy, and scandal-ridden British aristocrat, a professional gambler, and a regular at London's poshest clubs. Lucan was known for living really lavishly, despite the fact that he was in a marriage that was crumbling, and he was in a lot of debt. Remember the fact that he was a gambler. On the night of November 7th, 1974, Lucan's children's nanny, 29-year-old Sandra Rivet, was bludgeoned to death in the family home. That same night, his estranged wife stumbled into a pub and she was covered in blood. She, too, said that she had been attacked, and she identified her ex-husband as the assailant. Lucan fled the scene, he abandoned his car near a port, and he was never seen again. Maybe this is a tale as old as time, of a rich guy trying to escape accountability for his actions. And he had a lot of rich people as connections. And so the theories are that maybe he used his aristocratic friends to help him escape to Africa or even South America. Over the years, there have been dozens of alleged sightings in New Zealand and Australia, even India. Others, however, say that he died by suicide, perhaps by jumping into the water near the port. In 1999, he was legally declared dead, but rumors persist to this day that he lived under a new identity for decades. And something really crazy is that just last year, Sandra's son Neil and an investigator tracked down a 90-year-old man in Australia that they believe to be Lucan living in secret. But they can't convince the authorities that it is him. Whatever the truth is, Lord Lucan remains Britain's most famous fugitive. Barbara Newhall Follett came from a family of very bright people. For example, her sister was the first woman graduate student at Princeton, but she was known to be the brightest of them all. She wrote poetry at the age of 4, and in 1927, at just 12 years old, she published her first book entitled The House Without Windows, and it was a critically acclaimed book. The Sunday Review of Literature called the book almost unbearably beautiful. Her next novel came out 2 years later and was also critically acclaimed. But her fame faded. Her father and her biggest champion, who supported her the most out of everybody, up and left their family. So her life slowly unraveled. In 1939, at the age of 25, after a fight with her husband, whom she suspected of having an affair, Barbara walked out of their apartment and she took $700, the equivalent in today's money, which would have been quite a bit of money back then. She didn't leave a note. There was no trace. And for some reason, her husband didn't even report her missing for 2 weeks. And she was never seen again. So why is this mysterious? Well, some people believe that she died by unaliving herself. But most people think that she was probably murdered, possibly by her husband, who acted strangely and avoided questioning. Of course, a pretty young woman walking alone at night with a decent chunk of change in her pocket was probably at risk from other threats too, although nobody would have known that she had that money in her pocket. For years, her mother tried to reopen the case, but she got nowhere. She also was very suspicious of Barbara's husband, and she even wrote to him. And this is what she wrote: "All of this silence on your part looks as if you had something to hide concerning Barbara's disappearance. You cannot believe that I shall sit idle during my last few years and not make whatever effort I can to find out whether she is alive or dead, whether perhaps she is in some institution suffering from amnesia or a nervous breakdown." In 2019, writer Daniel Mills published his theory that the police did find Barbara's body in 1946, but misidentified it as someone else. And if he is right, and Barbara did indeed die by suicide, then a life that began with so much promise ended in a really deeply sad way. Michael Rockefeller was American royalty. The Rockefeller family is extraordinarily rich, in part because of their interaction with Hitler and the support of Nazis. They helped to develop and fund various German eugenic programs, including the one that Joseph Mengele worked in before he went to Auschwitz. So, great, great news there. You might be able to tell that I'm not a fan. The 23-year-old son of New York Governor and future Vice President of the United States, Nelson Rockefeller, who would die eventually, during sex. Michael was an art dealer, an art collector. He was an anthropologist and an heir to one of the richest families in U.S. history, Dirty Money. To his credit, he often turned his back on a life of luxury to seek out adventure. So in 1961, Michael and a colleague were on an expedition in Papua New Guinea to collect slash steal indigenous art when their pontoon boat capsized, stranding them miles from shore in a catamaran. After drifting for a while, Michael, tired of waiting, decided that he thought he could make it to land. So he paddled off toward land using empty gas cans or flotation devices. His colleague watched him until he disappeared on the horizon, and he was never seen again. Despite a 2-week search for the Rockefeller involving, get this, ships, airplanes, helicopters, thousands of locals scouring the coasts and swamps, no trace of the heir was ever found. At first, it was assumed that he'd drowned. Maybe he was eaten by a shark or a 15-foot crocodile. Perhaps he died from exposure. After all, he had been 14 miles from shore when he set out. But New Guinea's coastal tribes had a complex history with outsiders, including brutal colonial violence. Rumors quickly spread that Michael had made it to shore, only to find himself being killed and cannibalized by members of the Asmat tribe. Then his bones were being turned into weapons and fishing gear. Over the decades, several documentaries and books, including Savage Harvest, have explored this particular theory. One even claims that Michael assimilated into tribal life and lived in secret. But despite deep dives by journalists and even the Rockefeller family using their deep pockets and connections, there was never a definitive answer as to what happened, and he just disappeared. Dorothy Arnold was everything that you would expect from a New York socialite. She was elegant, she was well educated, she was extravagantly rich, and constantly in the public eye. She dreamed of being a writer, but she kept her failed publishing attempts a secret from her family because her parents disapproved of her writing. And then one day, she disappeared. On December 12th, in 1910, the 25-year-old left her family's Upper East Side home to go buy a new evening gown. She stopped by a bookstore and she bought a copy of the short story collection called Engaged Girl Sketches. Then she chatted briefly with a friend on Fifth Avenue. That was about 2 p.m. And then nothing. She vanished in broad daylight of one of Manhattan's busiest streets, and she was never seen again. Her family waited a full day before going to the police. Not because they weren't concerned, but because they were worried that it would embarrass them if she had run away. Her father even hired detectives to look for her in complete secret, worried that a public scandal could hurt, quote, her reputation. But weeks passed, and then months. No body, no note, no confirmed sightings. Over the years, countless theories have emerged. Some believe that she died by suicide because of her failed writing career, or an unrequited love. And could the book she bought about engagements be a clue? Well, others suggested that she died during a botched abortion, and her body had been quietly disposed of. A few speculated that she was murdered in Central Park, or perhaps kidnapped right off the street. One popular theory is that she faked her own death, and she fled to Europe to start over. She had, after all, bristled against her parents' protectiveness. Her father, for example, refused to let her, at 25 years old, get an apartment of her own. But despite alleged sightings everywhere from Philadelphia to Texas, and at least two women who claimed to be Dorothy, they were proven to be imposters, there was no proof of that at all. Her heartbroken mother died in 1928, still hoping for answers, while her father, who dismissed the idea that his daughter would ever disgrace the family by sneaking off without a trace, passed away a few years later. In one of his final interviews, he declared, after all these years, "I am convinced that Dorothy is dead." Jim Sullivan was a folk rock musician in the style of Graham Parsons or Nick Drake, who appeared in the classic film Easy Rider. His 1969 debut album, entitled UFO, was filled with lyrics about desert roads and aliens and leaving Earth behind, the kind of stuff that didn't exactly scream chart topper at the time, but it probably would have done pretty well right now. But it did begin a cult following years later. In March 1975, Sullivan left LA to drive to Nashville in hopes of kickstarting his music career. En route, he checked into a motel in Santa Rosa, New Mexico. Then he bought a bottle of vodka and drove out of town. He was spotted 26 miles away at a ranch, and then he was never seen again. His car was later found abandoned with his wallet, his ID, his guitar, and all of his belongings still inside. Locals say, though, that he seemed really disoriented in the days before he vanished. Theories ranged from dehydration or a mental health crisis to foul play, including an unaliving by the mafia. But no remains were ever found, and no one reported seeing him after that day. The really strange, weird, and surreal part is how closely his disappearance mirrors the themes of his music. His album UFO opens with a track about a man who drives into the desert and disappears. The eerie coincidence made fans wonder, was Jim trying to vanish? Did he have a breakdown? Or, as some joked, was he actually abducted by aliens? Well, he was in New Mexico. Nearly 50 years later, there are still zero clues about what happened to him. His old friend Al Dobbs told the New York Times once that, "I think he stumbled into something or someone that was unforgiving." It's kind of poetic to picture him still walking out there somewhere, but something happened. Connie Converse was writing and recording deeply personal songs in the 1950s, way, way before the singer-songwriter era made that cool. 1950s version of a Taylor Swift. Her voice was intimate and her lyrics literary, but her life became increasingly complicated as the years rolled by. After years of struggling to find an audience, Connie left New York in the early 1960s, and she moved in with family, and she fell into a depression. In August of 1974, she wrote letters to friends and family saying she needed to, quote, "make a new life." She packed up her Volkswagen Beetle and she drove away. She was 50 years old, and no one has heard from her since. So why is this mysterious? Well, in the decades since, a new generation fell in love with her melancholy brilliance, but what happened to her remains unknown. The letters she left behind could be interpreted as suicide notes, but they did mention that she was going to return to New York and to her music career. And if they were suicide notes, why was her body never found? Or her car, even? 10 years later, her brother contacted a private investigator about searching for her, but he decided to let it be. He decided that if she wanted to start a new life, then that was her right. And he's hoping that that's what happened, and that there's not a darker explanation. Percy Fawcett was the actual inspiration for Indiana Jones, a British explorer obsessed with the uncharted Amazon and the belief that a lost ancient civilization was hidden within it. He called it the City of Z. And in 1925, the 57-year-old Fawcett set out into the Brazilian jungle with his 21-year-old son, Jack, and Jack's best friend, Raleigh. They had big plans to finally locate the city that he'd spent decades theorizing about. "We shall return," Fawcett told reporters ahead of that trip, and he said, "and we shall bring back what we seek." However, after sending a final message via a courier from a remote outpost, the entire party vanished. No confirmed trace of any of them has ever been found. Over 100 would-be rescuers and adventurers followed in Fawcett's footsteps in the years that followed, and some of them vanished too. Others were killed by tribes in the region. A few came back convinced that Fawcett had died, or with really wild stories that they had seen him living among the indigenous people, but none of those accounts were ever verified. So, what did happen to them? Well, they were in the jungle, and there's a lot of ways to die. So, piranha infested waters, dangerous jaguars, the risk of malaria, all kinds of different snakes, bugs, parasitic infections, and starvations. There were a lot of ways for a tragic end for this group to happen. Some people believe that hostile tribes killed him, and that is possible. In 2005, Kalapalo Indians claimed that passed down through their oral history that he had made the mistake of wandering into their land. The Kapapalos were warlike. And then there are the die-hards who still believe that he did find the mythical city, and the three of them decided to stay there. So let's go with that, because that's the most Indiana Jones way to go out. Harold Holt was the Prime Minister of Australia, a very close ally of the United States, and a friend of President Lyndon B. Johnson. He went for a swim and vanished into the ocean. On December 17th, 1967, Holt went for a swim at I think it's Chavo Beach near Port Sea, Victoria. It wasn't a great idea. The conditions in the sea were rough and the currents were strong. Holt swam out to sea and then disappeared from view forever. The government launched one of the largest search operations in Australian history, but nobody was ever found nor washed up onto shore. The reason it's mysterious is because, well, he most likely drowned, but Holt said he knew the swimming spot like the back of his hand. So, conspiracy theories quickly piled up. Some believe that he faked his death to run off with a lover, and I'm assuming that that means a male lover, as who would fake their death to run off with somebody that wasn't going to, force them to come out of a secret. Others claimed that he was a Chinese spy who was picked up by a submarine. More grounded theories, though, point to the rough conditions and the strong currents and the fact that Holt had a history of heart issues. But even then, consider this. The leader of a country vanished during a casual swim and was never seen again. Glenn Miller, this is my favorite one. Glenn Miller was one of the world's biggest stars. I mean, huge. If you've ever seen an old movie that has the couple swing dancing, they are probably swing dancing to Glenn Miller's music. It defined a generation. But when World War II began, he enlisted as a captain in the U.S. Army Forces and led the Armed Air Forces Band with a mission to boost morale. This was a lot of hard work and a lot of hard times and a lot of bad, dangerous situations and traveling. It worked, though, and Miller was promoted to major just a few months before he was last seen. On December 15, 1944, Miller boarded a small aircraft in England and it was headed for Paris, where his band was scheduled to perform. Somewhere over the English Channel, the plane vanished. There was no mayday call, there was no crash site, there were no bodies. It was just gone. It is likely that they hit bad weather and the plane went down. But no wreckage was ever found, and wartime secrecy muddles the records and the ability to find out the truth. One of the most famous people in the world did indeed vanish. Consider the popularity of a Taylor Swift or a Michael Jackson just vanishing, completely gone, never found in a wreckage. Rumors began after the aftermath. Some said the plane was hit by friendly fire, while others spread a very far-fetched conspiracy theory saying that he died in a Paris brothel and that the whole plane story was just a story to cover up his death and how he died. Officially, Glenn Miller was lost in a wartime accident, and we can only guess at exactly how he met his demise. And sadly, his fans learned of his tragic death on Christmas Day, 1944. Ambrose Bierce was one of America's greatest writers, a journalist and an author who survived the Civil War and wrote the classic The Devil's Dictionary, which defines peace as a period of cheating between two periods of fighting. In 1913, at the age of 71, Bierce joined Pancho Villa's rebel army in Mexico as a war correspondent. He wrote a few letters from the front, and one ended with the line, "To be a gringo in Mexico, that is euthanasia." And then he completely stopped writing. Perhaps he saw what would be the ending of his life. There were no confirmed sightings, there were no remains, and no definitive reports of his fate. An official investigation by the U.S. consular officials was conducted, but it only confused things further. Some say that he was killed during battle, most likely the siege of Ojinaga in January of 1914. Others think that Villa's men executed him, and some believe that he was never in Mexico at all, that his letters from Mexico were just to hide the fact that he secretly went to the Grand Canyon to commit unaliving, to die by himself. And the truth will never likely be known. And our last one, Oscar Zeta Acosta, was a larger-than-life figure. A Chicano activist, he was a lawyer, a novelist, and the real-life inspiration for Dr. Gonzo in Hunter S. Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. His character was played by Benicio del Toro. He was a firebrand in every sense. He was always in the middle of something extremely intense. In 1974, Acosta, who had become increasingly erratic and involved with drugs, traveled to Mexico, where he called his son and told his son that he was about to board a boat full of, and I quote, white snow. And that was the last time anyone ever heard from him again. How would you like your dad calling you with that? So we're going to say, what does a boat full of white snow mean? Well, I'm going to guess cocaine. His buddy, Hunter S. Thompson, seemed to think it was something like that too, saying that Acosta probably ate too much peyote and walked off a cliff. Later, though, he investigated his friend's disappearance and speculated he might have been killed by drug dealers or was the target of a political assassination. But no one really knows. Some think he might have faked his death to escape his mounting legal troubles and his public burnout. His son Marco said the body was never found, but we surmise that probably, knowing the people he was involved with, he ended up mouthing off, getting into a fight, and getting killed. And maybe it was as simple as his son says. But like all of these stories, there isn't a definitive answer, and we will probably never know. Thank you for coming to my channel, and good night.